Before the story truly begins, there's something worth sharing with those who chose to be here. Every powerful journey starts with people who believe in it. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month. So if this story pulls you in, subscribe, leave your like, and become part of that dream. In the mid-1970s, Harlem was a place where belief could make you rich or get you killed. And no one understood that balance better than Frank Lucas. After the death of Bumpy Johnson, Frank didn't rush to claim the crown. He studied the streets, respected the old rules, and quietly built an empire by cutting out the middlemen, flying pure heroin directly from Southeast Asia into the United States. What the newspapers would later call ruthless, Frank called efficiency. To the public, Frank Lucas was invisible. No flashy suits, no loud clubs, no unnecessary enemies. At home, though, he was something else entirely. With his wife, Juliana Farrate, he allowed himself softness. She was pregnant, carrying the future he never thought he deserved. She knew the risks of his world, but she also knew his discipline. Frank never raised his voice at home. He never brought business through the front door. To him, protecting his family was the only rule that mattered more than power. But Harlem was changing. Old loyalties were cracking, and bitter men who once circled Nicky Barnes like wolves were now starving. One of them, a low-level mobster with a loud mouth and fading connections, watched Frank's rise with hatred. He believed Frank's silence was weakness, his restraint fear. To him, hurting a man's family wasn't crossing a line. It was proving a point. He waited for the right moment, convinced that one act of violence could shake the entire structure Frank had built. That moment came on a cold evening near Riverside Drive. Juliana climbed the narrow stairwell of an aging building, one hand steadying herself, the other resting instinctively on her stomach. The city felt unusually quiet. Then, without warning, the man stepped out of the shadows. There were no words exchanged, no threats, just a sudden, brutal shove. Juliana lost her balance, her body crashing down the stairs as her scream echoed through concrete walls. In that instant, something sacred was broken. And in Harlem, breaking something sacred never went unanswered. The ambulance lights cut through Harlem like a warning no one could ignore. By the time Juliana reached the hospital, word was already moving faster than sirens. Nurses whispered. Doctors recognized the name and avoided eye contact. Juliana survived the fall, and against every expectation, so did the baby. Bruises bloomed across her body, but her breathing was steady. When Frank Lucas arrived, there was no chaos, no shouting, no threats. He walked in quietly, wearing the same plain coat he wore every day, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He took Juliana's hand and listened as the doctor explained the injuries. Frank nodded once. No emotion crossed his face, but something inside him locked into place. Frank stayed only a few minutes, long enough to kiss his wife's forehead, long enough to whisper that everything would be handled. When he left the hospital, Harlem felt different. The streets noticed his silence, and silence from Frank Lucas was never a good sign. He didn't call meetings or summon soldiers. Instead, he began walking, through barbershops, through numbers houses, through buildings where men owed favors and remembered names. He didn't ask directly who was responsible. He didn't need to. In Harlem, disrespect leaves fingerprints everywhere. By nightfall, Frank had the story. A reckless mobster, once connected to Nicky Barnes' old circle, drunk on bitterness and convinced the new king was soft. A man who believed fear only worked if it was loud. Frank listened, thanked the messengers, and sent them away. No threats were issued. No orders were spoken. That terrified everyone who heard about it. The man who had pushed Juliana felt the shift almost immediately. His phone stopped ringing. Friends crossed the street when they saw him. A dealer refused to sell to him, muttering Frank's name under his breath. Even the air felt heavy. He laughed it off at first, telling himself that Frank Lucas was too smart to react emotionally. But deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't just attacked a woman. He had challenged the one rule Harlem still respected. And Frank Lucas had 48 hours to decide how the city would remember his name. By the next morning, Harlem was awake in a different way. Not louder, quieter. Store owners open late. Conversation stopped when unfamiliar footsteps passed. Frank Lucas hadn't said a word publicly, but his name moved through the borough like a cold wind. Everyone knew the clock was running, even if no one could say when it had started. 48 hours was the number people whispered, though no one could explain why. It was instinct, the kind that comes from surviving too long in places where power never announces itself. The man responsible tried to regain control. He made calls, offered money, promised loyalty to people who once drank with him. None of it worked. A former associate warned him, voice shaking, that Frank wasn't angry. He was methodical. That scared him more than any threat. He packed a bag, planning to leave the city before nightfall, convinced distance would save him. But Harlem has a way of closing its doors without ever locking them. The bus ticket was canceled. The driver claimed a mistake. The hotel refused him a room. Every exit quietly disappeared. Instead of violence, pressure came from places he didn't expect. His brother was fired from the docks without explanation. His cousin was stopped by police twice in 1 hour, questioned, then released. His mother received an unannounced visit from 2 men who spoke politely and left her trembling. They never mentioned Frank Lucas. They didn't have to. The message was precise. Consequences had layers, and he was only standing at the surface. As the second night approached, the man stopped pretending. Panic replaced arrogance. He understood now that this wasn't revenge, it was isolation. Frank Lucas wasn't hunting him. He was removing him from the world piece by piece. And somewhere in the city, people who shared his blood began to realize that his single, stupid act had put all of them in the path of a man who never missed. The third day never came. Before the 48 hours were over, the man's family broke first. They gathered quietly outside a modest building in the Bronx, far from the flash of Harlem, and far from any witnesses who might recognize them. There were no weapons, no cars idling nearby, no bravado left. Just people who finally understood what it meant to anger the wrong man. Mothers don't calculate power. Fathers don't negotiate pride. They beg. And that was exactly what they came to do. Frank Lucas met them himself. No intermediaries. No raised voices. He stepped outside, dressed simply, his face calm, his eyes unreadable. The family fell apart almost immediately. Apologies spilled out in broken sentences. They swore they hadn't known. They promised to make things right. One woman dropped to her knees, hands shaking, pleading for mercy not for herself, but for the child Juliana had carried down those stairs. Frank listened without interrupting, his silence heavier than any threat. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, almost gentle. He explained that pushing a pregnant woman wasn't business, wasn't strategy, and wasn't courage. It was stupidity. And stupidity, he said, was expensive. He told them he would not kill their son, brother, cousin. Death would have been simple, forgettable. Instead, the man would leave New York forever. No phone calls, no visits, no protection. Anyone who helped him return would suffer the same fate he narrowly escaped. Frank made it clear, this was the only mercy they would receive. The family thanked him through tears. Frank turned away before they finished speaking. That night, the man disappeared from Harlem without a trace. No body was found. No arrest was made. He was alive somewhere, breathing with the knowledge that his name meant nothing now. And in Harlem, being forgotten was often worse than being dead. Harlem adjusted quickly, the way it always did after something unspoken but undeniable had occurred. People didn't ask questions. They didn't need answers. They felt the shift in how doors opened faster for Frank Lucas and how conversations stopped the moment his name was mentioned. The absence of violence spoke louder than any gunshot. Everyone understood that a line had been crossed and redrawn, thicker and darker than before. Frank hadn't just defended his family. He had redefined the cost of disrespect. Juliana's recovery became a quiet priority. Frank reduced his appearances, delegating operations with precision and clarity. Those close to him noticed the change, not weakness but focus. He was colder in business, sharper in judgment, intolerant of impulsive men. The heroin operation continued, cleaner and more controlled than ever, reinforcing the reputation that Frank Lucas was no longer simply powerful, but untouchable. Rivals recalculated alliances. Old enemies chose silence over ambition. Law enforcement sensed something too. The streets were calmer, yet more disciplined. Informants spoke less. Deals fell into place without conflict. Detectives later described this period as unsettling because nothing seemed to move unless Frank allowed it. He had become the gravity of Harlem's underworld, pulling everything into orbit without force. At home, Frank sat beside Juliana in the evenings, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing. He said little about what he had done, and she asked nothing. They both understood that some protections didn't need words. The city outside their window buzzed with rumors, but inside, there was only one truth Frank carried with him. Anyone willing to harm his family would lose far more than they could ever take. Time passed, but the memory of those 48 hours never faded from Harlem. Years later, men who had survived the drug wars of the 70s would still lower their voices when the story came up. Not because of what Frank Lucas did, but because of what he chose not to do. There were no bodies, no public executions, no reckless displays of power. Just consequences delivered with precision and restraint. That restraint became his signature. As Frank's empire expanded, so did the attention from federal authorities. The Knapp Commission had already exposed deep corruption within the NYPD, and prosecutors were hungry for a high-profile conviction that could symbolize the end of Harlem's untouchables. Frank knew the pressure was coming. He prepared for it the same way he prepared for everything else, quietly, methodically, without panic. Rivals who once dreamed of replacing him began to fear survival more than ambition. They understood that Frank Lucas wasn't driven by ego. He was driven by boundaries. Cross them, and you weren't destroyed, you were dismantled. Piece by piece. That understanding kept the streets calm, even as the government closed in. When Frank was finally arrested years later, many in Harlem were surprised by how little resistance there was. No riots, no retaliation. People simply nodded and went back to their lives. The balance he had created remained, even in his absence, and that, more than his wealth or his violence, was his true legacy. The child Juliana carried was born months later, healthy and quiet, unaware of how close his life had come to being rewritten by one man's recklessness. Frank held his son only briefly in the hospital room, his large hands careful, almost unsure. Power had never frightened him. Prison hadn't either, but the weight of that child did. It represented something he could never fully protect from the world he had chosen. At home, Frank changed in subtle ways. He spoke less about the streets and more about timing, patience, and limits. Men around him noticed that reckless behavior was no longer tolerated at any level. Anyone who acted without discipline was removed, not violently, but completely. Frank had learned that chaos invited attention, and attention invited destruction. His organization became quieter, smarter, and harder to penetrate. Juliana watched him closely. She understood that what happened on those stairs had drawn a line inside Frank that would never fade. He wasn't seeking redemption, and he wasn't pretending regret. He was seeking control over the few things that truly mattered. Family, stability, survival. Everything else was expendable. Outside, Harlem continued its endless cycle. New hustlers rose. Old names disappeared. But one lesson stayed carved into the city's memory. There were rules that even criminals didn't cross. And the price of forgetting that lesson was not always death. Sometimes it was living with what you had destroyed. Harlem never needed monuments to remember its rulers. It remembered through silence, through habits, through the way people crossed streets or lowered their eyes. Years after Frank Lucas' fall from power, the story of those 48 hours still lived on, not as legend, but as warning. The details changed depending on who told it, but the ending never did. A man crossed a sacred line, and an entire family learned what real power looked like. The mobster who had pushed Juliana down the stairs was never seen in New York again. No prison record, no obituary, no rumors of revenge. He existed only in the quiet suffering of exile, carrying a name that opened no doors and earned no loyalty. His family survived, but survival came at the cost of dignity. They had begged once, and Harlem never forgot that either. Frank Lucas eventually lost everything the streets had given him: money, freedom, reputation. But some victories couldn't be seized by the government or erased by time. He had drawn a line so clear that even his enemies respected it long after he was gone. Not through fear alone, but through certainty. The certainty that consequences were unavoidable. And so the city moved forward, as cities always do. But deep in its memory, one truth remained untouched. A mobster pushed Frank Lucas' pregnant wife down the stairs. 48 hours later, his entire family begged. And Harlem learned, once again, that the most dangerous man in the room is the one who never has to raise his voice.